All right, so you may have heard of Orecco. It's a Sligo startup which has been making pretty big waves all around the world in the area of bioanalytics as well as a number of other areas. And they've been working with teams such as the Dallas Mavericks, Newcastle United and many, many more besides. And also as well, of course, with a couple of individuals such as Padraig Harrington and Sonia O'Sullivan in the past. And I'm delighted to say that their CEO and co-founder, Dr. Brian Moore, joins me on the line live from Los Angeles. Good morning to you, Brian, or good night, I should say. How are things?
Good morning, Owen.
So I say there you're making waves, which probably suggests to people that this is a new startup, which isn't really the case at all. Could you briefly tell us a little bit about the background of Orecco and what you've been working on over the past, I guess, couple of decades?
Of course. So I suppose in terms of the recent progress, it's almost like a 10-year overnight success. In the bigger picture, I've been working on this area for about 20 years and started my work with Sonia back in the day, and it's just evolved year on year as we advance the science and assemble a world-class team and then start deploying what we do around the world. So it's been a phenomenal, I suppose, 2 decades, and that's why a late night here after an early start, I definitely need to get the moisturiser going on. You've obviously got that done in the studio.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. It's a lot of work that you do is in the area of blood samples, and I mentioned a couple of teams at the start, but ultimately you talk about working with Sonia O'Sullivan, I think in the lead up to the Sydney Games in 2000. What were you doing with her at that point, and how has the science moved on in the year 2019?
Really, I mean, it was such an honour to work with Sonia. I was completing my, I was kind of starting my PhD under Professor Craig Sharp in Brunel in London, and we had just a simple idea: was could we use advanced blood testing to kind of pick up iron deficiencies, maybe 10 weeks to 12 weeks before they actually manifest itself, which is a big deal for an endurance runner. And I suppose it's funny when I look back now. I still get goosebumps when I think of Sonia in Homebush racing down the home stretch and trying to chase down Szabo. But really, I suppose Sonia was so far ahead of her time. There's often elements that we delivered and did with her back in the day, and our coach Alan Story, that maybe that athletes still haven't caught up with. She was so far ahead of the game.
What sort of things are we talking about?
Really, it was we got an understanding of how the numbers were shifting across her training phases, picking up early signs of an iron deficiency, like I said, using the retic values, and also interpreting those numbers in the context of her training. So, for example, we weren't necessarily looking at normal reference ranges, which would be like comparing your a blood test result to the general public or someone sitting in the stands. We were working out her individual range and seeing how the numbers changed as she went through the different phases of the year. And we did manage to pick up, early signs of when she was fatigued, and then use that. It was very early. We were still trying to figure this out. But could we pick up signs in the blood test that maybe she needed a bit more rest or was pushing too hard? And Sonia's MO was always to push hard, so it was using the numbers to help her to optimize her performance.
And that is the key thing, picking up early signs of fatigue, and it is one of the reasons why your science could be so pivotal to the future of sports science, the fact that you can identify injuries before they get to crisis point.
Yeah, it's a fascinating whole space, and to be honest, I would say in terms of trying to predict injuries, I would argue is a fool's errand, really. It's so complex, it's so multifactorial. However, there are definitely, what we can do is reduce the risk of it happening. But to do that, you need the context. And I suppose with the explosion of data now that's available in professional sport, but also to us all with our Fitbits and our Apple Watches and bedded sleep monitors and our Garmins, it's how can you make sense of all that data? And that's the kind of key question, really.
Yeah, and that is your job. I guess there was a New York Times piece written about your work, specifically with the Dallas Mavericks and the kind of impact that may have on the league as a whole, and the NBA, and on sport as a whole. So when it comes to what you're doing right now with the likes of the Dallas Mavericks, you mentioned working with Sonia and measuring the likes of iron deficiencies. How much more data are you collecting now, and what data are you collecting now for the athletes?
Yeah, it's completely changed, Owen, in terms of the amount of information that's available to us. So we're using for example, so we'll use the biomarkers. When we started with Sonia, it was a full-on venous sample that you'd take, and you could do it maybe once a month, realistically, and it was sporadic. Now we've developed a point-of-care test that's a little pinprick that your listeners or viewers might be familiar with almost like a diabetic test. So it's a little drop of blood, and within 4 minutes we can get a readiness state for that athlete, which is like a check engine light on your car. And then, if you're seeing that the athlete isn't adapting to the load, then you can run the full diagnostic, like taking the car to the garage. So you've got that on the biomarker side. But what's fascinating now is when you map that against the GPS data that you'll see with the players will have their accelerometers between the shoulder blades. You have acceleration, deceleration data. We have jump data from testing, from performance tests. We have sleep data. So it's endless, or I suppose it's never ending. So, what the challenge is then to make sense of that data. So we have an amazing team on the analytics side led by Professor John Newell out of NUIG, and on an insight partnership where it helps us to really make sense of all these numbers.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like you mentioned GPS data there. Is it fair to say that what you provide is sort of internal information on what the external information is actually telling you? That ultimately it's all a marriage here, that all the information needs to complement one another. It's not one single thing that'll help sports teams find out more about their athletes.
Absolutely, you nailed it. So it's really a combination of the internal load, what's going on under the hood for the athlete, married to the external data. And so there's amazing data now available. So obviously, from an Irish perspective, you got the great work Stat Sports are doing on the GPS side, but also then Cryon Higo or TrackAb in the Premier League, or Second Spectrum in the NBA, where you're getting phenomenally rich data sets about every pass, every move, accels, decels, and then it's okay. Can we put the two together? And then to do that, you really need powerful computing and machine learning that people are becoming more and more aware of in terms of artificial intelligence. So can you find the signals in that data, and then can you translate into something useful for the athlete and the coach? Because ultimately that's our job, help the coaches make better decisions, and from an athlete perspective, prolong their careers by making sure they're in an optimal state of readiness.
Yeah, like I do want to ask you specifically about the NBA and the openness to teams and players to doing this, but just on the GPS data thing, since you mentioned it, like so many people involved with GAA teams will probably kind of realise the idea that the GPS data is kind of the new future for GAA teams with intercounty level. As Lee Keegan made very famous a couple of years ago, GPSs are being used on every single player at this point. Like I may be putting you on the spot here a little bit, Brian, but are GAA teams at intercounty level, do they have all the information to get the best out of their GPS data? Are they using companies like your own to actually get the best out of them?
I think it's right at an interesting point. So if you look at where the Premier League was over the last kind of 5-6 years, there's a broad acceptance of GPS. But now there's an understanding, particularly in the Premier League and abroad, that, to be honest, just to visualize the data and look, you're getting some interesting information around discovered accels, decels, but now's the time to get cleverer. And so what our team have built is actually a drill planner where using AI, we can dig into that data, and you can actually predict what the load will be for each individual player. So over an hour-long session, the engine will predict to within 5 yards of distance and maybe half an acceleration what that player will do. And it'll also flag what load is too low for a player, who needs more work, and some players that's too high for.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Dallas Mavericks, because ultimately you work with a load of different teams, and naturally some of them don't want to actually tell us that they're working with Orecco, but the Dallas Mavericks have gone on the record and said that they are working with you. How open were they to the prospect of working with Orecco? Because obviously we know with their owner, Mark Cuban, I don't want to call him an eccentric, but he's certainly more open to new ideas than most people are.
Yeah, I suppose he's an entrepreneur who's networked in the 4 billion mark, or in around there, and he comes from a tech background, and I think team owners are more and more coming from that background, like Steve Ballmer from the Clippers, ex-Microsoft. So I actually sent a cold email to him, and I did take a day to draft it, but when I pressed send, he came back within 40 minutes, which kind of shocked me, and a man with the amount of business interest that he has, how he can respond to email that quickly. My inbox is a disaster. So he came back very quickly and was saying, he completely got the concept, and he would say that analytics, or AI, ML, will eat the lunch of analytics. So it's not just, we have to go beyond aggregating data and visualizing. You need to dig into it and be able to get predictive. So he was all over that. Sent his trainer, who's Casey Smith, in touch with us, and I suppose over the course of 6 weeks decided this is what he wants to do. And we started small. We started with the biomarkers and then the point of care test with the real-time readiness. And then it just evolved now. So literally, he's constantly pushing us to get better, and it's very exciting for our team.
Yeah, it certainly is. Like we've seen pictures of Luka Doncic on screen there, which is ultimately the pivotal area, I'd imagine, for any NBA owner right now, is to protect their young talent from getting injuries. And I guess this is actually a fascinating case study because the Dallas Mavericks have gone out and acquired Kristaps Porzingis, who's gone through horrific injury troubles at the New York Knicks. Is he thinking about those specific players when he gets in touch with you? And I know we've mentioned injury prevention already, but he's thinking to himself, I can get my best players on the court more often if I utilise the right science available to me.
Absolutely. And it has to be, evidence-based. There's so much noise in this space where, a couple of white papers and a marketing exercise, what they're looking for is evidence-based. We have 300 peer-reviewed papers, and it's a fascinating, I can't speak about specifics, obviously, but if you look at Dallas, for example, you have Luka, who's just starting his career on one side, and you've got Dirk, who's 40, his 20th season in the league. And so, in the same with any team, you're looking at the team you have, how can you support them, protect them. And there's a phenomenon known as the rookie wall, whereby, typically in January, February, young athletes who come into the league are very fatigued and tend to get sick or hurt or the performance drops off just because of the sheer load of it. So what the whole beauty of this idea is that it's all about the individual and individualizing everything that you're doing. It's not, one size fits all.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Just a couple of things to put to you. In that New York Times article I mentioned, they have quotes from Dr. Anthony Romeo. I'm not sure if you know him, but he's the chief of orthopedics at the Roman Institute in New York, and he's a former physician for the Chicago White Sox and has worked with the Chicago Bulls as well. So he says he'd maintain a healthy level of skepticism about your work until it reveals more about the biomarkers it studies and the data being gathered. So he says at some point they're going to have to share their data in a way that it can be repeated so that we know it's true. Is that something you're planning on doing?
I think it's a very fair question, and we're scientists, so you welcome it because there's got to be a rigor to what you do. What we will do, so we do publish. So we have, as I said, 300 peer-reviewed papers across different areas from sports science, clinical nutrition, performance nutrition, applied statistics, and we publish selectively in those areas. We're not going to give the game away because we've been spending 10 years developing this, but for us, obviously the proof is in the pudding. I think if you look at Newcastle last year, they reported an ESPN analyst, Ben Dinnery, a 67% reduction in soft tissue injuries. Casey Smith, 0 days lost for the Mavs, which is way below the league average, and kind of it's a glimpse into what's possible. We don't have all the answers, we don't pretend to do, but what we say is that if you collect the right information, ask the right questions, and you deploy the right statistical modelling, amazing things are possible.
Yeah, for sure. One of the quotes that also stuck out to me from Dr. Romeo here, he says that he will be cautious and that it's investigational. He said it's a very interesting area of research and they applaud the efforts that they're making, but at this time nothing supplants outstanding coaches and trainers that can do a visual analysis and understand their athletes from the traditional methods to know whether they're training too hard or too little. And I'm not sure about that, to be quite honest with you. I'm not sure about the idea that actually your eye can tell you how close to fatigue a player is. Is this a stumbling block for you, Brian, that you come up against people who still believe that the naked eye is the best way and the only way to actually treat injuries or to try and foresee injuries?
I suppose, I don't honestly believe you'll ever replace a coach, or would you want to? Because the coach understands the athlete. They see them all the time. We're not designed to come in and, I suppose, take over different roles. But our job is to present information to help make better decisions. And often what you find with the open coaches that we've been working with, like Rafa at Newcastle is an amazing example, where he has collected data on training sessions back to when he was Real Madrid under 12s. He's really, really understands data and how to use it. And he would say, our job is to say, look, give him a preemptive warning. The article references an athlete where we flagged, in the days before, that their risk profile was really high, and they blew the calf, non-contact injury, no one near them. So I think, look, there's always going to be some skepticism. I think it's good to ask questions, but what we can say is that the eye will give you, maybe identify you. Coaches will see an athlete isn't making recoveries, looks flat. Sometimes you see your favourite team. I think in the Irish parlance, you'll say the team is flying. championship, and then they get there and they're flat, and it could be that they've overreached, it could be that they're under recovered, and it's multifactorial. Often it's what's happening away from the pitch or the training pitch rather than necessarily what's happening on the paddock.
Well, that's the key question, Brian, that every Irish sports fan will have. What can you do to make sure that the 2015 injury crisis doesn't happen for the 2019 World Cup?
Yeah, well, I think for us, it's really about deploying the latest science, see how we can be of assistance to what are the coaches' questions. That's the amazing thing out of, like, Dr. Paul Catterson at Newcastle is amazing for asking, like, really pushing us. And what I love about elite sports, and you probably do too, is that it's ruthless. That if you don't add value, you're not kept around for very long. So it's a kind of testament to our team that our contracts are running 5 and 6 years, and if it wasn't added value, we'd be gone. So I think what's possible is now with the wealth of data, the challenge is it's often 1 or 2 individuals in an organisation that get dumped all the data, and it's up to them to figure it out. So we operate as a team within the team, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, just one final thing before we let you go. What happens next from a business standpoint? Are you always looking to get into new markets and speak to new teams?
Yeah, so, I mean, since the New York Times article, the phone has been hopping, really, which is great. And again, they've identified what we can do that's different, but also where this is going to go. And so the more data you have, with the partnership we have with Insight, then we can do spectacular things. For us, what we want to do, our ultimate goal is to make this all available to you and I, for the next, when we're preparing for our own sporting events, whether that's the 5-a-side or a 10K or half marathon, and can we get high-end science and make it available to us all? So we've just launched an app called Fitter Woman. I don't know if you've come across it. It's aimed for female athletes and takes into account the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, we actually did a piece on that, an off the bench piece. We can actually check that out on youtube.com/offtheball. If anybody at home wants to check out Fitter Woman a little bit more. It's exciting times, Brian. We wish you all the best, and we wish you, it's an unbelievable time for sports science, and I'm sure from your own perspective as well, it's an extremely exciting time as well. Thanks a million for staying up late and taking the call, and we wish you all the best. Dr. Brian Moore, thank you very much.
No problem. Appreciate it.